Katerina Jakob watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Jakob saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review for January 7th, 2022. Yes, 2022. This is our first episode in 2022, Rainer. I'm Chris Driscoll, and along with me here is Rainer Shea. Let's see. I guess we could just jump right into the first topic. We've got several topics tonight, so want to kind of rush into it. Nationalists are on the rise. How protests in Kazakhstan turn violent, and why Russia feels it can't stay silent. This is from an article from RT, the RT TV network.
Got muted.
I should say also that the first part of this comes from CNN, the first paragraph, I guess you'd say. Dozens of protesters were killed and hundreds injured during clashes in Kazakhstan. A police official from the largest city, Almaty, said Thursday, as troops from a Russian-led military alliance of post-Soviet states begin their operations in the Central Asian country to help quell unrest. At least 13 law enforcement officials died in Almaty and 353 people were injured, state-run Kabar 24 TV reported. What's behind the current violent unrest in Kazakhstan, and why is political stability in this huge former Soviet republic of such great importance to Russia? Events in Kazakhstan are unfolding at breakneck speed, with the situation changing on an hourly basis. Initially, it seemed that protests against soaring energy prices would not turn into anything more serious. Since then, however, the country has asked for help from the Collective Security Treaty Organization, a Russian-led military bloc, and its soldiers have engaged in fierce street battles with armed marauders. Kazakhstan has always been viewed as one of the most stable post-Soviet countries, with the transition of power from its first president to his successor managed by local elites, initially seen as smooth and efficient. However, today, the country is perhaps facing its toughest challenge since it became independent 30 years ago. RT has analyzed the reasons behind the unrest in Kazakhstan. Footage of protests in Kazakhstan has spread all over the world. Demonstrators are forcing their way into public buildings, driving away military vehicles, and disarming soldiers. They have set on fire the mayor's office in Almaty, the country's largest city and second capital, which has now turned into the epicenter of the protest movement. The protests started January 2nd in Western Kazakhstan when the price of fuel went up. Liquefied natural gas is used by most local citizens as car fuel instead of gasoline. The protests went on, and Kazakh President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev instructed his government to address the matter of soaring gas prices. Soon, the state press service revealed that an investigation had been launched against owners of Kazakhstani gas stations aimed at identifying price-fixing cartels, and the government promised to introduce a set of measures in order to regulate the price of gas. They also said that some local owners had decided to reduce gas prices from 120 to 85 to 90 tenge. I guess that's their currency, which is about 21 cents per liter, as required by social responsibility edict for businesses by a social responsibility edict. But this was not enough to calm the protesting crowds, who resorted to even more radical actions. On the evening of January 4th, violent clashes with law enforcement officials started in many Kazakh towns, which lasted throughout the night. Policemen used batons, tear gas, rubber bullets against the protesters, who responded by setting official cars and specialized vehicles ablaze. In an attempt to soothe the demonstrators, President Tokayev agreed to comply with one of their demands and dismiss the government. Later, there were rumors that early parliamentary elections would be held. However, this second concession failed to appease the street movement. It was as if the concessions only angered the crowds even more. On January 5th, they went on to attack and set fire to administrative buildings. At the same time, the police were reluctant in trying to disperse the demonstrators, some of them even seen changing sides. Roman Yuneman, a Russian political figure who spent the first 18 years of his life in Kazakhstan, says that the local nationalists are the basis of the protest movement. It's not the liberals or hipsters who are protesting, it's the nationalists and the patriots. That's why you can see so many of them holding the national flag, and some are even singing Kazakhstan's anthem, said Yuneman. Yuneman points out that today's protests have the largest scale in the history of independent Kazakhstan. Uniman also commented on the opinion expressed by a number of experts who have said it may be the case that President Tokayev is not too keen on crushing the protests in order to use them to get rid of his political godfather, Nazarbayev, who still wields enormous influence in the country's politics. Nazarbayev is the former president. There have only been two presidents in Kazakhstan since independence, Nazarbayev and then Tokayev. Uniman believes that no one in Kazakhstan, including the protesters, perceives Tokayev and Nazarbayev as real opponents, and that even if Tokayev were to make any official moves against the former presidents, that would not clear him of anything or pacify the protesting crowds. Russia has already made a public statement saying it considers the current developments to be Kazakhstan's domestic business and strongly believes the country's government is capable of controlling the situation. But in case the protests continue, Moscow will surely pay more attention to its neighbor in the south. The border between Russia and Kazakhstan stretches for almost 7,000 kilometers, which makes it the world's longest continuous international land frontier and a key factor in Moscow's security strategy. Political stability in Kazakhstan is of utmost importance to Russia, since instability there makes it open to all sorts of threats from the south due to the fact that the border is not only vast, but stretches mostly through sparsely populated grassland plains and therefore is extremely hard to control. Kazakhstan also has a large Russian community. 3.5 million ethnic Russians account for 18.4% of the country's total population. Among them are the descendants of Kazakhs, who are known to have lived in the territory of present-day Kazakhstan since at least the 16th century. The head of Moscow's Eurasian Analytical Club, Nikita Menkovich, told RT that Russia is already part of the narrative around the current events in Kazakhstan. As relations between the two countries have gradually deteriorated in 2020 and 2021, the government has been losing popular support. The nationalist movements are on the rise, and many believe that the authorities will have a hard time securing Moscow's support and therefore are getting bold and eager to fight and win, he said. The analyst believes the level of tension is high in Kazakhstan due to the fact that the government has been too lenient towards the nationalists and did little to help them under control or keep them under control. And this may be fueling the protests. So what do you think?
No mentions of the National Endowment for Democracy.
No, not in this article, but I would be more than confident to think that the NED is in Kazakhstan if they're allowed to be. Now, Russia kicked them out several years ago, kicked out all of the imperialist nonprofits, fronts, basically. And I don't know what the situation in Kazakhstan is, if Kazakhstan has kicked them out or not. But whether they kicked them out or not, the CIA is still there, you know? I mean, fuck the NED. The NED's for wide open, you know, for wide open countries where anybody's allowed to just come in and start destroying from inside. If they can't do that, all they do is send the CIA in there and all kinds of other nefarious, espionage agencies, the NSA and the Defense Intelligence Agency and so forth. So, I mean, that doesn't really matter. If the Kazakhs did kick the NED out, which I suspect they probably have by now, then that's what's happening. I mean, they just send the CIA in there. They do it more covertly.
Yeah. Today, this person from Kazakhstan said to me that they appreciate how these protests are holding the government accountable for its neoliberal policies, but they're at the same time worried that NATO is going to be able to exploit the unrest.
Yeah.
And so I'm hesitant, and others like me are hesitant to take too strong of stances against these protests. Like if we said that all these protesters are as bad as the Hong Kong protesters, then I feel like we wouldn't be fair to them. We'd be jumping to conclusions, because I have also heard that the current Kazakhstan government is very far right. It's extremely elitist. It's definitely not socialistic.
Yeah.
And now I hear that it's been in deteriorating relations with Russia. So when I hear that the government is kind of enabling these protests, these nationalists, then it sounds like the imperialists hope to leverage this towards creating a further wedge with Russia and ultimately with China by extension.
Yeah.
And that seems to be as much as we know about the situation in terms of the mechanics of imperialism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, your point about Kazakhstan not being socialist. Well, Kazakhstan is socialist. I mean, Kazakhstan's economy is far more socialist than any country in Western Europe, for example.
I thought Belarus was the only former Soviet state that stayed like that.
Huh?
I thought Belarus.
No, Belarus is the only former Soviet state that did not give away all of its nationalized industry and kept it. So they have an enormously nationalized industry. Kazakhstan is not like that. Kazakhstan went through a whole reform period where they gave away a lot of their industry, but still there's a lot left that is nationalized. So I'll put it another way. If I had to guess, I don't know because I haven't looked this up right at the moment, but if I had to guess, I'd say about 25% of Kazakhstan's economy is nationalized, whereas in Belarus, all of the large scale industry, all of the industry that has more than 500 workers is nationalized. And at least 50% of its industry is nationalized. The only part that's privatized is small and medium sized businesses. So there's the difference. I mean, Belarus is much more nationalized than Kazakhstan. But what I was going to say is that, Kazakhstan in relation to a country like the United States is tremendously nationalized. We'll put it that way. But still, they do. I mean, the guy who runs it, Toko, whatever his name is, he is, I wouldn't call him a nationalist, but he's a pretty much of a politician who will use nationalists, and that's what he seems to be doing in this case. He's not taking this very seriously, although he did call in the I can't remember what it's called, the security It's the CIS's security arm. You know, the CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States, which is what used to be called the Soviet Union. The CIS has a security wing that just brings together coalitions of military forces to bring to hotspots if they're really needed within the CIS. So the CIS security wing has sent troops into Kazakhstan just in the last couple of days. And so, you know, the American media emphasizes Russian-led military forces, but it's really not Russian-led military forces. It's the CIS's, you know, they have the CIS has an agreement between all of the nations in the CIS that when they do need a military force like this, each country will contribute a certain number of soldiers to the force, you know.
Yeah,
and then the CIS sends them in, so it's not Russian led, it's CIS led.
Another thing to note about this situation when it comes to the question of whether it's just another color revolution or something we should support is there's been no media buildup in the weeks and months prior to this.
No.
This isn't what I've been hearing from other communists who've been discussing this.
I'm agreeing with you. No, there has not been.
Oh, I see.
Or maybe I should have said, yes, you are correct. Yeah, it is kind of erupted into our view very quickly. I don't think of this as a color revolution. This is not something that's created by the CIA. Okay. What I think this is that this is a nationalist counter-revolution. This is a counter-revolution by nationalist forces within Kazakhstan. In other words, the far, far right wing, I would just call them fascists, really. This is a fascist eruption within Kazakhstan for the purpose of overturning whatever is left of the Sovietization of Kazakhstan. But these are nationalists, so they don't like the United States any more than they like these, you know, the Kazakh leadership. You know, I mean, they're nationalists, and you know, in my opinion, this kind of nationalist is a fascist. So I wouldn't, on the one hand, I would not be supporting these protests, even though the protests probably do involve a lot of just regular people who are pissed off about the gas prices, you know. So that part of it I would support, but I mean, this is a nationalist uprising.
That seems like something that could become more common as U.S. imperialism declines and as it becomes less able to become the common denominator behind political factions worldwide. You could see these kinds of upwellings more arising from their own volition, and not all of these upwellings will be in the progressive direction. A lot of them will also be reactionary.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascism comes up when you know, in times of severe decline of capitalism like this, you'll see fascism rising its ugly head. You know, I mean, when I say that this is not a color revolution, that does not mean that I don't think that there's any U.S. involvement in this. I think that U.S. forces, probably CIA, are involved in helping to agitate this, you know, but I think they're agitating forces that are not really pro-American forces. You know, we're not seeing, like in Hong Kong, for instance, it was pretty clear in Hong Kong, these fuckers were carrying American flags around, you know. I mean, these were fascists with American flags. They were, this was a, you know, Hong Kong was an attempt at a color revolution. These people in Kazakhstan who are rising up today, they're not carrying American flags. They're carrying Kazakh flags. You know, they're genuine right-wing fascist nationalists. And they want to take their country over and turn it away from the semi-socialist country that it is today and turn it into a real, honest to God, fascist capitalist nightmare, you know? So, yeah, that's it's a pretty interesting thing going on there. Next on the list is the role of continuous warfare in the age of imperial decline. Rainer Shea.
I've studied the history of the North Korea-South Korea divide and how continuous warfare has defined the Korean Peninsula ever since the peninsula was liberated from Japan and the U.S. took over in recolonizing part of it and then trying to recolonize the upper half of it. All throughout the last several generations, the North and the South have been divided, even though there's the same nation, and forced to be at war with each other. It's a really twisted situation that the imperialists have engineered. And they've engineered this so that they can retain their capital, their military strategic hold over the South. And the role that continuous warfare has had in this fortification of imperialist power in the South is the war has, and when I say war, I mean the Korean War that's never officially been allowed to end. No formal peace treaty has ever been signed, aside from the apparently informal declarations of peace that North and South Korea have been making in recent years. Those are ambiguously effective. Anyway, the purpose of this continuation of warfare between the North and the South is to allow for the South Korean government to suppress communists, or at least that's a big part of it. Aside from obviously the exporting capital, the presence of capital there, and the presence of military outposts for the U.S. within the peninsula. Anti-communist repression and propaganda is a big part of why they perpetuate the war there. The perpetuation of the war has allowed for the National Security Act to be passed and perpetuated. This act lets the government prosecute anybody who speaks positively about North Korea, about Korean socialism. Nobody is allowed to point out that living conditions are in many ways better than they are in the South. Living conditions in the North are in many ways better without going to jail. And the anti-communist repression isn't as severe throughout the rest of the imperialist countries. You can legally in the United States say that you like North Korea, but the propaganda is just as strong. And the stigma against being pro-communist is just as strong. And I feel like at a certain point, the legal repression in places like the United States is going to get just as strong, if not more. I mean, we know about the Jakarta method. We know about how far anti-communist repression can go. It can escalate into mass murder campaigns, which is why I constantly advocate for communists to get readied in self-defense, to really build up their organizations for a dire scenario. And the perpetuation of war is bringing us closer towards this. I think what could spark off that dire scenario in the United States is the start of World War III, of a war with China. And it's been building towards that point for decades with the perpetual military diplomatic provocations made by the United States against China and its allies. It's been building up to that with the constant arms race that Washington has instigated. We're getting towards a dire point, and in many ways it's already dire. I mean, living standards have deteriorated so much throughout the last half century, even in the richest countries, in the imperialist countries. Tens of millions are slipping into extreme poverty, even in the United States. And anti-communist propaganda is now stronger than ever due to this continuous war paradigm.
Yes, it is a situation that is kind of dire. The continuous warfare combined with the imperial decline is a prescription for a nightmare. And we really need to be ready for it. Communists need to be ready for it. Socialists, working class people need to be ready for this. And, you know, it's a shame in a way. I think working class people in general are much more ready for this than their presumed or presumptive leadership in the communist movement. So that's something for people to think about. Anyway, the next issue up here is Sudan Prime Minister resigns as revolutionaries push to end military rule. This is from Sameena Rahman, January 4th, 2022, from Liberation, which is the newspaper of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Sudan's Prime Minister, Abdullah Hamdok, resigned on January 2 amid widespread protests demanding an end to the military rule that have faced deadly repression. Hamdok, a civilian, announced his resignation on a televised address. Hamdok's agreement with the Sudanese military after a coup in October was massively unpopular, and protesters took to the streets against what they said was a betrayal of the revolutionary process that began in September 2018. Hamdok first became prime minister in August of 2019 as part of a power sharing agreement with the military that was supposed to eventually result in a transition to a elected government. But Hamdok was deposed in a military coup in October 2021. When the armed forces led by Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan forcibly seized power and declared a state of emergency. Hamdok, however, shortly returned to office by signing a political deal with the military the following month. Hamdok justified this move as an attempt to avoid casualties, but the military repression of demonstrations continued. Tens of thousands took to the streets demanding the establishment of a full civilian rule and denounced Hamdok's move to seek an accommodation with the military. This coup dissolved a 2-year-old joint civilian military sovereign council, which was created after the 2018 revolution deposed long-standing ruler Omar al-Bashir. Hamdok was put in power to oversee Sudan's government until the next elections, but in practice had limited authority. Just hours after Hamdok's resignation, police violently dispersed protesters, killing at least 3 people, according to the Central Committee of Sudanese Doctors. Hamdok's resignation represents the failure of his earlier acceptance of an alliance with the military. Supporters of the revolution, including unions, neighborhood resistance committees, and political parties like the Sudanese Communist Party, rejected this power sharing from its outset. Despite continued violence, the military repression, protesters have been leading actions in the hundreds of thousands to press their demand for a completely civilian government. Even though Hamdok's resignation itself was not a key demand, this development is an indication of the determination and strength of the movement fighting for the complete removal of the reactionary military's grip over the government, as well as the depths to which military leaders will sink in their attempt to undo the revolution.
This is bad news. I remember 2 years ago talking about how Sudan had undergone an anti-imperialist revolution because apparently the dictator who they'd overthrown was favored by the CIA. And I remember speculating, wondering, where is this going to go? Because this was obviously not a proletarian revolution. The capitalist state was not overthrown, only the government was overthrown. So there was definitely an opening for counter-revolution, and now we're seeing it. I feel like all we can do is take this as a lesson as communists to try to make whatever social upheavals happen produce an overthrow of the capitalist state. I feel like the communists didn't have enough control over that situation.
Yeah, and still don't. But on the positive side, the working class is in the streets in the hundreds of thousands, and they do seem to be having an effect on the military, forcing the military to back off to some extent. But you're correct. Overall, I mean, a revolution. I mean, I'm not familiar with the Communist Party of Sudan, the Sudanese Communist Party. You know, so I have no clue what they were saying at the time, but whoever the leadership of the movement in 2018 was, they should have gone all the way. But who knows, maybe they couldn't. I don't know. I don't know enough about the situation. But here, what I've just presented to you is as it stands today, according to Liberation. So we're definitely gonna have to keep an eye on this. It could, I mean, you know, the working class demonstrations could swell and become very, very large, and who knows what comes out of it. So we'll just have to keep an eye on it. The next topic up here is perpetual war is capitalism's hope for surviving the 20th the 21st century by Rainer Shea?
Capital is in trouble because the U.S. empire is in steady decline. 4 years ago, I think it was now 5 years ago, even the Pentagon admitted in a study that the U.S. hegemony is rapidly declining and may even be collapsing. And this is because Washington can only offer the global South even worse exploitation, whereas China offers the global South economic liberation and increased living standards. So Washington's only hope for holding on to hegemony or to onto a semblance of hegemony is to manufacture what amounts to a collapse of much of civilization as we know it today. Washington has successfully destabilized much or even most of the Horn of Africa. It's working to do the same to much of Southeast Asia. It's destabilized most of the so-called Middle East, Southwest Asia for decades, and it's starting to maneuver that within Latin America as well. It's trying to destroy all of the states that are embracing China's development projects. And when it comes to places like Sudan, it's succeeding. Thankfully, it's not ultimately succeeding within Ethiopia, though the casualties in that destabilization campaign are incomprehensible. It's one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world that the U.S. war machine has manufactured, and every day the empire tries to manufacture consent for an invasion of Ethiopia. And we're going to see more and more of these conflicts, more and more of these interventions, whether overt or covert, that Washington is carrying out to try to reverse the progress of history, sabotage China's Belt and Road Initiative. This was hinted at in a 2019 Pentagon report that named Bangladesh as one of the countries that the Pentagon now thinks may one day need to be intervened within in response to the climate crisis. Bangladesh, no way coincidentally, is also one of the most major benefactors of the BRI. Bangladesh has been experiencing such great, unprecedented infrastructural progress because of China. And Washington aims to exploit the climate crisis as a means for justification for invading and destabilizing that country and numerous other countries. So the list is constantly growing of the countries that Washington seeks to destabilize, or that it's currently destabilizing. And this process is going to continue, this process of manufactured chaos, until the imperialists finally get their tools taken away.
Yeah, the imperialists are definitely on a rampage in several countries. They're hitting the Horn of Africa. They're hitting, they're trying to hit countries in Latin America. They're hitting countries in Asia and Africa, even hitting Ukraine in Europe. I think it's first the largest country in Europe, actually, if you don't include Russia. We can start to see a kind of proxy war effort rising up now against China, hitting those countries that China is pulling into the Belt and Road Project with those countries that are the weakest in that category. They're definitely hitting weaker countries. Stronger countries like Venezuela, for instance, is a very strong country comparatively. It's got a very heavy duty military, you know, and so forth. And although they continuously throw this or that terrorist activity at Venezuela, they don't seem to be taking very seriously anymore the idea of a coup to overthrow the government or anything that, you know, which is what they did originally back 20 years ago. I think it was exactly 20 years ago that the coup happened against Hugo Chavez. So yeah, it's the way of things. It's the way things are developing. Okay, next on the list, Betty White's Anti-Racist Act and Appreciation. Monica Moorehead of the Workers' World Party wrote an article showering praise on Betty White, who died on December 31st, just a couple of weeks shy of her 100th birthday, which is on January 17th. It's really a shame she didn't get to 100, huh? But 99 is pretty damn good too, if you really think about it. White was, of course, a multi-Emmy award-winning actress who appeared on numerous television shows from the 1950s up until just last year, really. I think the last show she was on was that one with the on TV Land with the other women. There's some kind of a, you know, women buddy show. But she was like the old grandma who took care of them all. And that, I think that show went on until last year or the year before, one of the two. Don't quote me on that. But, you know, Betty White had a hell of a career in television. She was on Password back in the day for years and years and years. As a matter of fact, she was married to the guy who was the host of Password, the TV show. It was a game show. You probably never heard of it, but it was a big game show back in the day. Anyway, she had a lot of TV shows, but Monica Moorehead, yeah, of the Workers' World Party, pointed to a incident in the mid-1950s when Betty White had her own variety show, and she featured a black dancer. His name was Arthur Duncan, and CBS executives were totally put out by this. I mean, they were, oh, this is just terrible to have a black man dancing on her television show. If you think about it, we have come a long way in allowing or in winning, let's say, some social rights for black people since then. Although economically they're just as bad off as they were in the 1950s. Anyway, Betty White told him in no uncertain terms, you know, fuck you, basically. She told him, Arthur will continue to dance on my show and there's nothing you can do about it. And if you decide to cancel me, that's that. I'll just move to another network, you know? So, anyway, Monica Moorehead told the story of that, and it's a good article. I recommend it. We'll have a link to it. Anyway, Mrs. White will be sorely missed by many of her fans, including me. R.I.P. Betty.
Well, I don't know too much about this. Other than that, Betty White has been a really beloved figure from what I can tell on the internet, kind of like Keanu Reeves, but for so many decades.
Yeah, she's a beloved figure, but she was always a woman of morals, and a woman who stood up against racism. So we've got to give that to her. And she was on many beloved shows. I mean, I don't expect the younger crowd to really be very familiar with her. You guys have moved on. You got your own, uh, stars and heroes and so forth. But for people my age and people even much younger than me, really, the Betty White was a fixture on the TV set for a long time, for 60, 70 years, really. I mean, hell, she was 99 years old when she died, almost 100 years old. So, and she was pretty much on the TV constantly from the 1950s right on up until the last 2 or 3 years, So that's pretty incredible. Anyway, next on our list tonight, NATO cognitive warfare and the destruction of the truth. Rainer Shea.
It's so easy to obfuscate reality, to make reality be seen as irrelevant when it comes to anti-communism. And I think what is essential for this is the neutralization of the US left when it comes to anti-communism, when it comes to fighting anti-communism. More than neutralization, the US left has been pretty much fully co-opted towards taking the same active position of anti-communism that the right does. Michael Parenti talked about this. He talked about how the US leftists overwhelmingly participate in the same kind of McCarthyism that reactionaries participate in. And I'm always trying to gain insight into why this attitude is so normalized, because more than pointing a self-righteous finger, I want to recognize these traits within myself. What's still wrong with me? How can I improve? How can I make myself not so susceptible to the diseases of the imperial center that overwhelmingly afflict so much of my fellow leftists in the US? And I think it comes down to hubris. We're some of the most privileged people in the world, despite the negative impacts that neoliberalism has had on us. And there's an impulse to be paternalistic, to not want to sit back and listen to the revolutionaries who are fighting against imperialism out of practical necessity. In the U.S., you kind of have to go through a big learning process. You have to make a moral choice when it comes to fighting imperialism. Whereas in the global South, overwhelmingly, it's the conditions of people that radicalize them towards the anti-imperialist position. They don't have a choice, whereas we do for now, at least until imperialism totally collapses and we're screwed unless we embrace revolution. So there's this arrogance and entitlement that leads to the kinds of takes that we see when it comes to existing socialism, even when it comes to relatively small socialist movements like the Sandinistas or the Iranian Revolution. or the Chavistas, or the Movement for Socialism party in Bolivia. You saw how David Pacman was decrying the Movement for Socialism party after the 29 Bolivia coup happened. This is the kind of chauvinism that is normalized.
Yeah, I see it a little differently. I mean, I don't think hubris has anything to do with it. What I think has to do with it is in the 1930s and 1940s, the left in America, at least the intelligentsia of the left in America, was on board with the Communist Party. They weren't supporting imperialism in the way that you see today. But then, starting in the 1950s, in the very early 1950s, the CIA had a project going. It was called the Congress of, what was it called? The Congress of Cultural Freedom. And they went out and deliberately recruited intellectuals all throughout the United States and Canada and Europe to this project, to the Congress of Cultural Freedom. And this Congress of Cultural Freedom had numerous highly well-funded magazines, newspapers, and journals, for which all of these most famous intellectuals of the left wrote. And that then filtered down into the, into what was large parts of the left. And it was anti-communist, it was pro-imperialist. It was a subtle way to kind of bring the left over into the party line of the CIA, and then all of a sudden, a lot of these same intellectuals who were in the Communist Party, or supporters of the Communist Party, or supporters of the Socialist Party in the 30s and 40s, they went over to the CIA, and they still pretended to be left. They talked about Marx and blah, blah, blah. But from then on, the left, what they call the left, the pseudo left, the synthetic left, they've been they've gone on this kind of anti all of the existing socialist countries, and they've been, and then the other part of this that really had a big impact is that starting in the 30s, the Nazis had a lot of extreme propaganda against the Soviet Union. And in the 40s, when the CIA started recruiting those Nazis, part of the reason they recruited the Nazis was to use those Nazis to carry on that same anti-Soviet propaganda. And that propaganda spread all kinds of lies against the Soviet Union. Stalin is killing millions, 10, 20, 30 million people in gulags and murdered and blah, just outrageous lies. And the same left that was taken in by the CIA through the Congress of Cultural Freedom started getting spread all these Nazi lies. So you combine those two things, And that's what's wrong with the synthetic left in the United States, what I call the right, because they really are right wingers, they're not left.
Yeah, I was trying to say, you don't think hubris has anything to do with it? Well, now that you mentioned those things, you explained that perspective. Yeah, definitely there's been a extreme propaganda campaign, and this propaganda has been even more severe and immersive than has been the case in the global South. Well, but from an emotional perspective, yeah, you can say that when anybody takes a false position on something, hubris factors into it. They're what they're doing is refusing to do more research because they assume that they already know best.
Yeah. Well, the one good thing in all this is that this doesn't really affect the working class much. So working class don't read the, highfalutin journals of the left, of the synthetic left. The working class has, on the one hand, been pretty much separated from the left since the 1940s, which is a shame. It's a bad thing. And it has caused an enormous gap in the traditions in the working class. But they're starting to come along now, as more and more working people become socialists, they start to learn these things. And so the gap, the gap between the left and workers is starting to be repaired. But we've got a long way to go in educating and educating the working class about the real left, the revolutionary left's traditions and so forth. Anyway, the next on the list and the final is we are still living in the shadow of the defeat of the USSR. And this comes from Struggle for Socialism, which is the basically it's the newspaper of the Socialist Unity Party in the United States, Socialist Unity Party USA. This I'm wrong. This is not the last one because there's one more article that you wrote to go. So let me get down to this one. We are still living in the shadow of the defeat of the USSR. It's an interview by Dmitry Strauss of Struggle for Socialism, of Greg Butterfield. Dmitry Strauss on November 30, 1991, Soviet Union. The Soviet president, Mikhail Gorbachev, announced his resignation, marking the end point of the history of the Soviet Union, the USSR. That was December 30th, 1991. So we just passed the anniversary of that a couple of, about a week and a little bit more than a week ago. What were you doing in these days? What were your political views? Did you support the process of disintegration of the USSR, or were you against it? Greg Butterfield. In 1991, I was a young communist activist. I had moved from the US Midwest to New York City a year before. I was working as the assistant to Marxist theoretician and organizer Sam Marcy, who had recently written a critical analysis of Gorbachev's perestroika program and its likely consequences. As at this time, Marcy was beginning to gain attention within the international communist movement as one of the few serious Marxist critics of Gorbachev and his treacherous collaboration with the US imperialism. So I was very fortunate as a young activist to help Marcy with research for his articles at the critical moment in history. It was a great learning experience. Beginning in August of 1991, when the State Emergency Committee attempted to halt the worst of the counter-revolutionary reforms through Boris Yeltsin's first visit to the US, then the Black October events of Moscow in 1993, our comrades organized street protests and educational meetings in New York, San Francisco, and other cities. We picketed the Russian mission to the United Nations to protest the arrests of State Emergency Committee members, the banning of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and Pravda, and later the massacre of defenders of the House of Soviets, which was their parliamentary building. I participated in all of the New York actions. 30 years later, I'm proud that I was on the right side of history in defending the Soviet Union and socialism. DS asks, what do you think about the current situation in the so-called post-Soviet states? Greg Butterfield says, the destruction of the USSR was the greatest setback for the global working class since the crushing of the Paris Commune. The burden of that defeat has fallen hardest on the peoples of the former Soviet countries. We know about the calamitous events of the 1990s when the life expectancy of the people in Russia and other Soviet lands fell at the fastest rate in history outside of wartime. We watched as tremendous achievements of the Soviet industry built up by the common effort of the workers were sold off piecemeal or allowed to crumble to dust. And workers and professionals educated under socialism were forced to immigrate and sell their skilled labor for low wages in the West. Today, none of the post-Soviet states has come close to achieving the economic and living standards of the Soviet times. A few people have gotten very rich, many have fallen into poverty, and most workers struggle on the edge of disaster, just like in every capitalist country. Some of the post-Soviet states have become neo-colonial subjects of the US imperialism and the European Union. Those that have tried to maintain their independence are subject to sanctions, constant threats of war, and color revolutions. Then Greg Butterfield goes on to say, the US ruling class promised workers a peace dividend after the destruction of the Soviet Union. This never came to pass and never could. Capitalist imperialism, as Lenin explained so eloquently more than a century ago, is constantly driven to war to expand its markets and redivide the world. For decades, the power of the USSR was a check on the unbridled imperialist war drive. Without the giant socialist state to reckon with, the imperialist war drive was unleashed, leading to unprecedented, endless wars, from the invasion of Iraq with Gorbachev's cooperation in 1991 up to this day. It does not take any special understanding of Marxism to see that the level of US aggression today towards Russia and China will inevitably lead to a new devastating world war unless the global working class is able to stop it by revolutionary means. This war drive is completely connected to the destruction of the world climate and the resurgence of fascist tendencies around the world. Our foremost task as revolutionaries is to build the movement to defeat them.
What communists need to learn from this, and I think that the most important communists throughout this last generation have learned it, is that you can't abandon the theory that was put in place, or that was put forth as a guiding ideology by Lenin and Stalin during the first decades of the Soviet Union. As Xi Jinping said, socialism failed in the USSR because it abandoned the lessons that were initially put forth. To embrace historical nihilism, to repudiate Lenin, to repudiate Stalin, was to abandon what made the Soviet Union sustainable. And this was basically the principle that the dictatorship of the proletariat should be absolute. It should not be compromised so that the imperialists can be appeased. And I think that's the big difference between the Khrushchev-Gorbachev revisionists and the modern Chinese government, despite their superficial similarities in terms of being more open to market reforms. The modern Communist Party of China is not collaborating with the imperialists like how those revisionists did.
Exactly. Very well put. Last on the list, left anti-authoritarianism has brought counter-revolution.
It's been one of counter-revolution's greatest weapons because it was basically founded upon the literary foundations of Orwell. Orwell, as Parenti said, was a prototypic red basher who pretended to be on the left. And it was the fact that he pretended to be on the left, pretended to be a socialist, even though he clearly had no concern for actual theory. He was just in his own head. He was full of himself. He had hubris, like I observed about these kinds of people. And he was on a mission to what he saw as morally cleanse the world of so-called Stalinists. And since then, the global bourgeoisie have used his counter-revolutionary ideas in literary form to indoctrinate perhaps hundreds of millions of people. In a lot of places, Animal Farm is required reading in school. And this has instilled so much of the US left with the kind of mentality you described, where Nazi propaganda has become a big factor in how the US left views countries like the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union and its modern equivalents.
Yeah, well put. Orwell or Blair, as he was really called, it is exactly what I'm talking about, was talking about just a little while ago, with the kind of synthetic left that was really not so much a creation of the CIA, but was brought in by the CIA and made their own, made into a tool of the CIA willingly. Because at least some of these people involved in in the Congress of for cultural freedom knew that the CIA was behind it all, and that the big CIA money is what was funding all these magazines. It's some of which I'm sure Blair slash Orwell wrote for. Yeah, it's terrible. Anyway, that's it for us tonight. Anything else before we go?
No.
Okay. Well, with that, I'm going to say good evening to everybody, or good morning, or good afternoon, whenever you're listening to this. And I hope you have a great new year, 2022. Let's hope it isn't as bad as 2020 and 2021, although it probably will be. And I want to invite everyone listening in or watching to join us again next week, when we will have another episode of Revolutionary Socialist Review with Chris Driscoll and Rainer Shea. And with that, I will bid you a sweet adieu.